Hi everyone, to those who came here. So since you're a small group, I guess we can keep this more as a discussion. I know that sometimes you don't want to interact that much, but this is your chance to actually have a discussion in a talk because, well, we all like open source and we probably have done something, so we have hopefully some experience there. So I assume everybody is using open source, right? I guess everybody is using it. Who is actually contributing back? Nobody. Whoa, okay. That is because I was actually honestly expecting kind of the opposite, that everybody would raise their hand and say like, oh, we're contributing back, because there was the Stack Overflow survey recently where they looked at how much are people actually contributing back to open source, and what they found is that 36% or so of the people say they never contribute back, but 28% say like, well, at least once a year, 23% like a couple of times a year, and then 12% say at least monthly or multiple times monthly. So there are a lot of people doing open source stuff. Okay, so how is open source working if everybody uses it but nobody contributes back? We don't know. Yeah, some people contribute, but not you. Okay, well then, I guess this is the perfect talk to get you started on this, because what you generally often see is that everybody wants well-maintained software, right? This is what we all want. And then, yeah, this is actually you, who is contributing back. And then if you ask, like, who wants to be a maintainer of an open source project, then people are even gone. Like, they just run away. That's kind of the thing that I see sometimes. Is anybody maintaining an open source project with a couple of active users? No? One? Okay, how many downloads or stars or whatever do you have? 300, okay. How many GitHub questions do you, or issues do you get a month? Not so much? Okay. So let's see where we can take this. So what I want to quickly cover is, first off, very shortly, licenses. Like, what are the possible licenses for your open source projects? Why would you want to use different ones? How to use open source software? This is a bit of a self-interest. Like, how do you ask better questions, and how do you improve the chance of actually getting an answer to your questions? Because I assume most of you have asked some questions already on open source projects and have not gotten an answer back. Probably, or that's at least a common thing that I see. And then we can talk a bit about contributing back to open source projects and to see how you actually make that happen. So why am I talking about that? I work for Elastic, the company behind Elasticsearch, Logstash, Kibana, Beats. We have some pretty popular open source projects, so we do see a lot of questions, like some good, some bad. So this is where my self-interest comes in. If I can show you how to ask better questions, we can help you more easily and everybody will be happier. That's the general idea. Sorry. So if you've never seen it, these are our open source projects. Probably you're using some or have at least seen them. They have a lot of users, they get a lot of questions. They are not super easy sometimes to use, but that's what makes it more interesting. We also have some stuff that is not open source, like we have cloud services, so that's not really in that realm, but we do a lot of open source stuff. So let's start quickly with licenses. What two main license groups do you have in open source? Sorry? Yeah, there are two main groups of open source licenses. You might want, so first off, you have the permissive ones. The permissive ones, basically, you can take the software and you can do pretty much whatever you want to do with it. Like, oftentimes you just need to keep the license in the source code, but you can even sell the software after modifying it, or you could compile it and sell it what you have. So that is the permissive license. Like, Apache is common, MIT, BSD, those are around. The thing that Apache has some additional clauses around patents, so that might be, especially as a company, make more sense than MIT or BSD. These are pretty simple, but they're all permissive, so you basically get the code and you can do pretty much whatever you want with the code. The other thing is copyleft. The copyleft licenses are like GPL and AGPL. Basically, you get the source code as open source, and all the modifications you do, you also need to open source them again. So I think Microsoft a long time ago said like, these licenses are like cancer because they're spreading. Like you have something that is GPL license, you build on top of it, you have G2, open source all the code that you have. That's why it's spreading. Is this a good or a bad thing? Well, it probably depends on what your plans are. Some people strongly prefer copyleft licenses because it forces you to open source the code. But I think in general, there are some older projects like the Linux kernel, for example, under the GPL license. But I have the feeling for many of the newer open source projects, like more permissive licenses are more common. Like MIT and Apache are very common licenses, for example. And fewer new projects start with GPL and AGPL, especially because companies are kind of scared to use them because there is this cancer aspect that it might spread, so you might not want to use them. So in order to kind of boost the use of the software, you might want to avoid those. What was the general public license and the Affero GNU public license? What was the difference between those two? This one here is kind of the classic approach. Like you download a binary, and anybody, whenever you provide the binary to somebody, you need to give them the source code. This one here also extends to services, like cloud services, for example, at least in theory. So it's not just you get the binary, but you use something, even if you just provide the code to somebody to use as a service, then you need to open source the modifications. So the general idea is that, or the shortcoming of the GPL is the times when you bought a CD, if everybody remembers what a CD is, you bought a CD with, I don't know, a Linux distribution, for example, and you got the binary, and with the binary, you had to provide the source code as well. With a cloud service, for example, that's not a thing anymore. That's why AGPL is trying to close that loophole. What happens if you push some code to GitHub and you don't add a license to it? What's the license of that then? No, there's no default license. GitHub doesn't force you into any license. Yeah, GitHub is actually maintaining this page. And they are very clear that if you make a creative work and that is code, it's under the exclusive copyright by default. And that basically means that nobody else can copy, distribute, or modify that work. So even if it's on GitHub and you can get the code, you cannot just use it. You always need to check what is the license and under what conditions can I actually use that. And the funny thing is, as soon as somebody else contributes to that, even if you're the author of the rest of the code, then it's kind of like all of that is kind of tainted under the exclusive license, and not even you can properly use it anymore because it's somebody else's work in there now as well. And then you have, in theory at least, takedowns and other legal risks around that. Is anybody checking with the dependencies that you're using what license they're under? Just out of interest? 2, 3, okay. Do you use like something like GPL and AGPL as well, or only permissive licenses? Only permissive? Okay. Right, so you have a list of whitelisted licenses, probably like maybe the OSI licenses. Okay, but you have that. Somewhere you were checking as well. Which kind of licenses do you accept? Only the permissive ones. Right, because it's the spreading approach. Okay, so you're all very much on the permissive approach. If you're already scanning for licenses, that's a good start, because if you look at the NPM dependencies, I don't know if anybody is using NPM, and then even a simple project has 10,000 dependencies, probably some of those don't have a proper license. And nobody really knows what you're getting yourself into there. As long as nobody asks, everybody tries to ignore the problem, but this is a real problem. No license is not a solution. There is no fallback permissive license or whatever. Basically, you're in deep shit if there is no license to some code that you're using. So don't do that. And then, this is not really a license, but this is something that plays into the ecosystem as well. The foundations, like the Eclipse Foundation, the Apache Foundation, what are they adding to that? So there is the Apache license, and then there's the Apache Foundation. And what generally the Apache Foundation is always adding is the governance model. Like, how do you run an open source project? Like, who can make decisions, and how is that process? If you only have something so if you want to start quickly yourself, you just create the GitHub repository and you push your code and you put a proper license on it and everybody can use it and that's working fine for everybody. But if you have something that you want to grow bigger and be used by probably corporations and you want to have more outside contributors, you might want to have this governance approach that you actually define, like, how can you make decisions? Or what happens with your open source project? Is it like just you being able to push code to that, or can outsiders contribute to that as well, or how do you run that? If you just have your own GitHub repository, well, it's up to you how you run it. But with the foundations, you normally have a model of how a project is being run and how decisions are being made. And especially if you're a company, you probably want to have that if you want to contribute to a project. So there is a bit more ruling around that and how to make that work. Any more questions to licensing? Good, because it's a boring topic anyway. Or nobody wants to do licensing. Everybody has to, but nobody wants to. So let's see about how to use open source software. Generally, developers like questions, I guess. Are there stupid questions? Probably everybody heard the statement that there are no stupid questions, right? So I think that is kind of true, that there are no stupid questions. And this might be very hard to read, but there is this XKCD comic. And they basically describe, like, each day there are that many people are born, and that many people learn, and by the age of X, everybody knows about a certain fact. So kind of by definition, on average, every day everybody, or that many people learn about some specific fact on every day, because when you're born, you don't know about it. When you're 30, you know about it. For example, if you throw a Mentos into a Coke, it will kind of explode. Which sounds like a stupid question of how does it do that or why does it do that. And when you're born, nobody knows that. And by the age of 20 or 30 or so, everybody knows. So there is this learning curve. So that's kind of the idea that there are no stupid questions in general. But I think there are better and worse questions. One quote that is very nice is this one that phrases it a bit more nicely, that there are naive questions, tedious questions, ill-phrased questions, questions put after inadequate self-criticism, etc. So the question itself is not dumb, because somebody wants to learn something, so that is legitimate. But sometimes people ask better or worse questions. And that will also define, like, how easy it is for you to get help when you ask for software help. The first thing that you always need to figure out is, where do you ask for help? Where should you go? The answer is normally it depends. That is always the question. But if you say it depends, you always have to specify on what does it depend on, because otherwise it doesn't make much sense. Do you open a question directly on GitHub? If you just have something. Sometimes, exactly. If it's a small project and they have a GitHub repository and it's not very clear and you don't have any other communication channel, probably GitHub is where you would go. If you open a generic question, how do I use that API on the Elasticsearch repository? What do you think will happen? So if you open a question like, how do I use that API on our GitHub, somebody will very quickly come and say, like, this is the wrong question for GitHub. Close, go somewhere else. And that somewhere else is normally, like, we have our own Discuss forum, so it's discuss.elastic.co, for example. There you can ask lots of questions. There is like user level questions. It's like, for us, for example, bigger project, GitHub is more like stuff that is broken or missing features. So it's really the core product and not how to use. For smaller projects, maybe it's fine to how to use there. Others use IRC or Gitter or Slack or Stack Overflow or whatever. Like, oftentimes for user problems, these are better places than GitHub. Just don't be discouraged if you open a GitHub question and somebody closes it right away and says this is the wrong place. It's not against you. It's just for the health of the ecosystem. For example, I know that Elasticsearch has, I think, more than 1,000 open GitHub issues, and nobody can keep track of those anymore. And I think Kibana has more than 5,000. By the way, this is the limit when GitHub normally displays the number of open issues. Once you hit more than 5,000, it just displays 5,000. We have that in our repositories, unfortunately. Don't Don't get there because then nobody knows what is going on. So first off, you want to figure out where do I ask my questions so that you will actually get an answer. How do you ask a question? Be specific what you want and why. So there are many ways of asking a question in a not so great way, and you might have experienced that yourself. One thing we see quite often is avoid the X and Y problem. So basically, you want to do X, but you also don't know how to do Y, and you think Y is very related. And then you start by asking the Y, this Y. You start like, you want to solve this problem, but this problem basically depends on this other problem. And then you start asking about this one. And what this often leads to is that you ask a very weird question and that people don't understand what is the context of your question. Like, what do you actually want to do? Like, this is super weird how you approach this, or you're using this in a weird way. If you would ask the X question right away and say like, I want to do this, like provide the right context, and by the way, maybe this other thing plays into it and I don't know how to do it, that makes much more sense rather than picking out the subset, which doesn't make sense in the bigger picture, so don't do that. Something, especially on any chat thing like Slack or Gitter or IRC or so, don't ask like, is anybody here to help? Because nobody will commit to that because they don't know what you want from them. They don't know, do they know the specific area, or is it very time consuming, or is it a good question or whatever. Also, don't just go into a Slack channel with 100 people and then ping everybody. Like Slack is especially bad with that, do an add here or so. You will not make a lot of friends if you do that. Also, don't just say hi, because this is really not actionable. What you want to have is you want to have a question that is actionable to actually enable people to go directly there. And generally, everybody has a lot of stuff to do, so if you just see a hi, nobody's going to react. But if you have a proper question, you know what's going on, then do that. And probably the same applies within your company as well. This is not just open source, but in general. So if you're all using Slack and somebody goes into a room and pings everybody and says, like, I have a question, we have somebody who will actually bash you afterwards. So we have some people who are very strict on that and don't like that. But that's a bit the company culture of how you do that. Also, don't ask, like, where can I find documentation on X? Because this doesn't add much context, and also this doesn't show what have you actually done, because Google is a thing, use Google or whatever search engine you want. What you want to do instead is, rather than phrasing this question, what you want to do is something like, I searched for the documentation on X and I found this thing, but it doesn't really describe what I'm really looking for. Can you tell me where I can find more information for that? Or if you searched and saw that this is missing in the documentation, for this one, you might actually open up a GitHub issue and say, like, maybe we should add more documentation for this specific thing. Because that's something actionable that will help others in the long run. So there it would make sense to open a GitHub issue with that information. But you need to tell people, like, I was trying to do this and I found that and I'm missing this other thing. Only within that complete context, then it makes kind of sense. Otherwise, it's not actionable. Don't ask, is X broken in version 1 or whatever the version is? How would you phrase that better? What could you ask instead? Yes. So this is missing all the context, and especially any path to get to the problem. Like, nobody understands what you're really trying to do here, so it's very hard to figure out what is going on. Also, don't do this. Can anybody help is not getting you anywhere. What you want to do is something like this. I ran into an issue with X, and then you describe the issue. And then you say, like, this is what I actually tried to do, or why am I doing this? And it's still broken. How can you show me how to debug that problem? A, it shows that you're kind of a bit more invested and you're not just pushing the problem to somebody else, but also you give somebody enough context and you show them that you're willing to actually invest more into that question. Because that will, especially in open source projects, help you a lot, that somebody will actually go the extra mile and put effort into your problem, rather than saying, okay, there are 500 other people asking something, I don't know what they want, we cannot help them out on that one. Okay, I sent this request and it doesn't work. This is a very common one that we see. You kind of see the pattern why this is probably not going to work out that well as a question. You probably want to say something like this. When I sent this request to Elasticsearch, what was I expecting and what was I getting? Why? So here you have much more context. You say like, okay, this is what I do, this is what I get, this is what I expect. These are the three things you kind of want to have, like I'm doing, I'm getting, I'm expecting. And with that kind of information, it will be much easier to actually make somebody answer your question. So also do something like, I'm running into the following problem after an upgrade to 1.0. What is the problem here? And the most important thing here is this one. Because I think there's at least a 20% chance that somebody says like, I have a problem, but they don't provide the right log file or stack trace or half a stack trace or all kinds of weirdness that doesn't help anybody. Like if you don't provide that, what you're actually getting, nobody will be able to help you. And generally, it's most important to actually provide a way to reproduce something. So for example, in the context of Elasticsearch, you say like, I tried to run this query and it doesn't work. Nobody can reproduce that. What you want to have is, you have the query, and ideally you give me 3 example documents that you say, okay, these are the sample documents I want to run against this query. This is what I'm getting, and this is what I'm expecting. And then I can also reproduce that very easily. If I have to spend half an hour to reproduce your specific scenario, I'm probably not going to do that. Also, I don't want to second guess what your specific scenario is. So do provide like the reproducer or the steps to get to something or the sample documents to actually do them. Sometimes people fully understand that. For example, this is a concrete example where on our Discuss forum, somebody actually asked a question and 10 minutes later they responded themselves then, you won't be able to help me properly if I don't provide all the details. And then they added all the details themselves without us asking. So this is an important step that you actually get to that to figure out like what does somebody else need to do to figure out what I'm trying to do. And with all things, time is very finite. There are probably 100 other questions we get every day. And the chances if your question is not very good that you will get an answer is very slim. And it doesn't help if you afterwards go on Twitter and say like, you're not answering any of my questions. Because then we will ask, okay, which specific questions? Then we look at your questions and then we will just say like, maybe you should ask better questions and then you will get help, which is a bit harsh. But sometimes asking a better question increases your chance of getting the answer a lot. And not just ranting about it, because that doesn't help. One thing that is very frustrating is this one here. You search for a problem, you find somebody who has exactly the same problem as you do, but they don't answer. Like there's a simple, like somebody had exactly the same problem as you do now, like 2 years ago, and nobody else has ever answered. And then you're like, dear Denver Coder 9 or whatever your name is, what did you see back then and what did you do? And you're totally stuck. So don't do that. The other thing that you should do is, or should not do is, and maybe this is a bit small to read, but here the, I don't know, the open source question police or whatever comes and says like, oh, you ask a specific question on the forum. And then after 2 hours you said, never mind, I figured it out myself. And this is all you do there. Then the police will take you away. Because don't just say like, oh, I figured it out myself. Just say like, this is the thing that I have done to actually fix the problem, because then you will help the next person. And we see that very frequently, that people just say like, oh no, it's solved, like please close this, or no, I don't need any help anymore, or whatever. And we're always like, okay, at least spend 3 minutes to describe what have you done, so the next person will not run into the same problem as you just did. Because that will just make life miserable for everybody. So don't do that. One final thing that you will always see is that use cases are very different. So don't always expect that what you're trying to do is the right way to do that others are doing. For example, maybe you know that XKCD comic where they say like, oh, if you were in some piece of software, if you were holding down the space bar, it was heating up the CPU. And that was a bug because it was burning unnecessary CPU cycles. And somebody used it as a feature to heat up their computer or whatever. Yeah, so somebody configured Emacs to interpret the rapid rise in the CPU temperature as control. so everybody can use that as a feature. You will always find weird stuff like that, so don't assume somebody's using something the same way as you do. It helps for context. By the way, one of the best ways not getting help is getting somehow impolite or throwing some stuff at people. So for example, I recently had this one here. Whatever you ask, like if you want to get any help and you end your question with what the fuck, this is a pretty sure way of not getting an answer or not getting a friendly answer. Or one of our favorites is always like, this shit is broken, which doesn't give any context and is more of an insult and is not getting you anywhere. So from an open source perspective, what you generally want to do is don't ask what your open source project can do for you, but what you can do for the maintainer. And that's kind of the nicer way to phrase it. So if you have a question, try to work it out with the maintainer and then maybe contribute like documentation back how to do that, or open an issue of how to fix a bug or add a feature or whatever. Because then you actually get invested into the project more rather than just complaining and taking. Okay, any questions on the using stuff? Or any anecdotes anybody wants to tell? Or any complaints? Any complaints against our software, by the way, from a question? Did anybody have any questions that we didn't answer? I'm just curious. No? Okay, good. Then we can all be friends. No, otherwise we would figure it out afterwards. Anyway, how do you contribute to open source software? Because in the end, we all want good open source software, but how do we get to that? There are generally two approaches, money and time. The money approach is normally a bit more for the company side. So if you are a corporation and you use a lot of open source software, ideally you contribute, and ideally you don't just do open source software yourself, but you contribute upstream. So you only, in my opinion, you only do open source properly if you contribute upstream. So to the projects you're building on. So if you do, for example, I don't know, some Java project and there are a couple of libraries that you use heavily like Jackson, you should contribute to Jackson, or ideally if you can, because that is what is keeping the ecosystem running. It's not just you doing open source, but actually giving back and to the ones you're building on. As a company, oftentimes money is a very simple way. So for example, the Eclipse Foundation has the memberships, where a company gets a member of the Eclipse Foundation, and then you work together on that one. So that's the corporate route that you can do there. Is anybody here a member of the Eclipse Foundation or through their company now? Okay, it's especially now with Jakarta EE, it's getting maybe a bit of a bigger thing, and some of the companies in the Java EE ecosystem or Jakarta EE ecosystem are now in the Eclipse Foundation and working there. The Apache Foundation is slightly different. Does anybody know how the Apache Foundation is organized? Apache had a different model. They have individual contributors always, but you can have a corporate sponsorship, and then you will be listed as a sponsor. But Apache is generally very much focused on the individual contributors to work on that. Or you can actually contribute to small projects. I'm just pointing this out because this is what I did yesterday night, for example. So 3 projects that we use heavily are Babel and Webpack in the JavaScript ecosystem and curl, because everybody uses curl. And we just started giving some money to these projects because we built very heavily on them. And this site, I just missed the name. You will find it. Whenever you want to contribute to one of these 3 projects, you will be redirected. The open source, whatever. Wait. This one. Open Collective. Now that I remember the name. Open Collective is the name. So this is a very nice way to actually contribute. Sorry, it's not on the screen. This one. Open Collective. Which might be a bit small, but Open Collective. This is just one place where you can contribute to projects. GitHub also recently started to have contributions that you can use. So for example, if you use ByteBuddy, anybody using ByteBuddy? The bytecode instrumentation that Raphael is doing, he's pretty much a one-person open source project. He has a GitHub page where you can contribute, like you have a monthly fee that you can contribute to his work so that he can continue doing that. By the way, most of the projects actually prefer monthly contributions over one-time contributions because you can plan much better with them. Because one-time is always a bit hard to see, whereas you want to have some recurring revenue. And if it's just a few bucks, that's also fine. I recently stumbled over this tweet, which I found interesting, that if you're a bigger company using open source, it might be a nice idea that every engineer just has a budget of like X amount per month, and they can just give it to the projects they think are important for their work. And especially with stuff like the GitHub sponsorship, it's very easy to actually do that and just give the money to the projects. Because otherwise it's a bit hard to always track down how do I give money to this specific project. On the other hand, the downside to this approach is that something like the Eclipse or Apache Foundation, they only generally want bigger donations, and you will only be listed as a donator if you have like a bigger donation of like 6K a year or whatever. So that's a different thing. Okay, that was kind of the monetary contribution. Now time. How do you contribute your time to open source? Ideally, or you probably do a pull request, right? Who has done a pull request to an open source project? 4 or 5, okay. A few. The number one thing you want to do before, especially before you write a big pull request to an open source project, is that you start a discussion first. Or at least for us, that was very important. Because sometimes people show up and say like, hey, I've invested a lot of work. I have 1,000 lines of code written here. Please merge. And we're like, well, this is actually not a feature we want to have. And then people are very upset and say like, but it's free. You can just use my work. It's free. But actually, the long-term maintenance cost of software is much more expensive than the one-term writing of code. So you need to kind of like pick what is the right thing to merge in the long run. And to avoid big disappointments, open an issue first. Discuss what you want to do before spending a weekend to write the code, because otherwise everybody is upset. And you might actually figure out, oh, somebody else is working on that, or oh, here are some pointers of how to properly do that. So that's I know in IT we all like to write code first, but sometimes it's better if you think and talk first rather than writing lots of code initially. Where do you ask, what is a good thing to contribute, or if you contribute something? Probably generally in an issue. Which leads me to a slightly different topic, but issue templates. Do you all know issue templates? Something like when you open an issue on the Elasticsearch repository, the details here are not important, but it's like you open an issue and then it has a lot of stuff filled out here, of stuff what to do. Because we want to see that, and you can pick different issues, like you can open a feature request, or you can report a bug, and they might have different templates, so they might have different things to fill out. So if you have a missing feature, you might need to add some information. If you have a bug, you might need to specify this version and on this operating system or with this browser or whatever, so somebody can reproduce that. Is it a good idea if you just remove everything from the issue template? No, but it's still something we see very frequently, like, I don't know the statistics, but very frequently people will just have something they should fill out here. They don't like that, and they just delete everything and then write, stuff is broken for me. No further details, basically. This is a sure way not to get your stuff answered. So if there is an issue template, even if it doesn't fully apply to what you're trying to do, just fill out what you can and then say like why you didn't fill out other stuff, and people will be much more likely be able to help you out or willing to help you out rather than you just delete that and go wild. The other thing is, we often think that only code matters. For example, documentation fixes, we appreciate documentation fixes a lot, because this will help 5 other people to actually not run into issues. So this will help a lot as well. So all the contributions matter, not just code and hardcore stuff. How quickly should you get a response for a pull request that you have opened? Yeah, ideally fast, but in reality it's not always that easy, because other obligations and people do other stuff. So generally you should have at least some patience. If you within 5 hours ping people and say like, why did nobody review my pull request, then it's not going to work out that well. And especially for bigger projects like us, there can be kind of a long feedback cycle. So I've seen stuff like somebody opened a pull request and then we had 90 comments or so until it was finally merged, because there were just a lot of iterations to fix stuff and get stuff in the right way, which might seem overly picky, but for the long-term quality of the project, this is also important. Is everybody familiar with the mechanics of the pull request in GitHub? So you fork the repository, so you have your own version. There you first start a new branch to actually make your change. Then you push that to your repository. You go to the GitHub project of the original project. There it will be, oh, do you want to open a pull request for this? You do that. And that's how the pull request goes in there. Don't fork and commit right into master, because that will not go that well for pull requests. Just stuff like that. Something you might run into is CLAs. Has anybody signed the CLA, Contributor License Agreement? Especially for larger projects, or I think for the Apache Foundation and the Eclipse Foundation, you also need that. It's basically under what terms you contribute your code, and you will certify that your code, for example, is not copied or stolen from somewhere else. It's just a kind of like sanity check for a project that you only have good code in there, and maybe it even allows relicensing of the code. So if the project ever wants to change their license, that they can do that without running after every contributor. Because I know there was a PHP project, and they relicensed, and they basically had to track down every single committer, and I think it took them half a year to get every single committer check or approve the license change. And they only couldn't find like 3 or 4 people, and it was 100 lines of code, and they had to basically replace those because the original author couldn't be found anymore. Okay, to wrap up, so what we've basically discussed is licenses. Which were the 2 licenses that you could have? Or the groups, the permissive ones and the copyleft ones. And either you can go wild, which is often good that especially corporations want to use them, or you force everybody into contributing back or open sourcing their changes, which also has their advantages. I was mostly, maybe this was a bit selfish, just to hammer down on how do you ask better questions, because for us it's also very frustrating if people ask bad questions, because then we can't easily help them. And people also get very frustrated because they say like, well, you're not a good project, you're not helping us out. Like, your discuss is empty. So we don't like that. And for contributing, communication first, and then work through whatever you need. So, we have like 10 minutes or so. Questions, discussions. Because I've been speaking a lot. What do you want to do? Or you're done for today because it is late. It is after 6. Who wants to contribute more to open source in the future? Well, that's a very good wish. We'll see how that goes. But it's not easy. Yeah. What is a good way to start? That's actually an excellent question. I will add that to the slides afterwards. Where's my browser? So what you have is, if I found my cursor, I'll use our projects because I know them, but this applies to pretty much all the other projects. So I'll make this a bit larger that you can see. So when you had to an issue, or to the issues, like 1,900 by now, and you have the labels, one that is easily picked up or that is very common is good first issue. We used to call them low-hanging fruit, but now good first issue is kind of a convention on GitHub that a lot of projects will actually have them. And these are like good starting points. So you can just filter out, and then you look at what might interest you or what do you think you can actually work on. So this is a very good starting point to actually contribute something. So I have no idea what this is about. That you can see it's an enhancement request, and it has the good first issue. And somebody even says like, okay, this is approximately what you need to do here to fix this thing. So good first issue, this is the thing you generally want to look out for if you want to contribute to any project. This is also oftentimes like, did anybody do Hacktober? One, okay. Did you look for these issues or Hacktober issues? Yeah, right. Exactly. So Hacktober is basically, I think it came out of DigitalOcean or a couple of companies around that. Basically what they do is in October, if you have issues that are labeled for Hacktober and you solve a couple of those, they will send you a t-shirt and some swag for that. It's just to get people into doing open source. And the idea is also generally, you have issues like the good first issues, which are good for contributors. You work with people through them, and of course the idea is that they will become long-term contributors afterwards. So you invest some work upfront with people. It might even be faster to write the pull request yourself at first, but if you gain a contributor long-term, this is a good investment. So that's why people do that. But this is an excellent point. I will add that to the slides afterwards. That good first issue is oftentimes, or many GitHub projects have that, so that's a very good starting point of how to get into those. And probably the other thing is that most of us are kind of selfish. And so if you run into a problem in an open source product that affects you, that's normally a very good motivation to get involved and solve your own issue. Because we are kind of selfish and want to have our stuff working. But that was a great question. Well, how much time you need to contribute? I mean, this is at best like a social contract of what you should give back. A couple of companies like Google, for example, they have this 20% rule, where basically it's one day of the week, which is normally Friday, that every engineer at Google, I think they still have that, that on Friday basically you can work on any open source project that you want on company time and basically contribute back that way. So for them it's 20%. If you don't have that sponsored by your company, it might be less. But oftentimes it helps a project already if you spend 1 hour and solve like open issues or questions from other users so that the maintainers or actually the people who write more of the code can focus on writing the code and don't have to solve the other stuff. So I think there is no real lower limit. Of course, the more the better always. But even if you spend 1 hour a week or a month, that probably helps a project already to get somewhere. So that's a good thing. By the way, the other joke that people make about the Google 20% time is that everybody at Google works 60 hours a week anyway. So the 20% actually are not a bad deal for Google because they all work at least 40 hours for the company anyway. So that's why they have the 20% rule. Any other? Yeah. Right. So the question is how to motivate yourself to do more open source. I think this is very tricky. So I mean, of course, if you don't have that much experience, it helps your CV that you can point out to that. On the other hand, that might long-term not be enough. So I always have the feeling like the thing I do is mostly because I have like my own problem and it needs to be more driven by that. If you just think about the CV, it's often, also CV driven is often not necessarily in the best interest of the project. But then your interest is not in the project, but in your own promotion basically. So you might do something for the quick win or you might just do 1 month of contributions, then you get hired and then you stop contributing again. This is for the long-term health of an open source project also not very helpful. So how to get there is just, I guess, realizing we all use a lot of open source and we wouldn't have that and couldn't go where we are currently going without all the work from others. It's great if you can, but some people also cannot, so I don't know. If you have family and need to spend more time with them, you probably don't have that much time or motivation to spend on open source. So I really don't want to blame anybody for not doing open source. We all know it's the right thing and would be nice. I don't think there is a perfect recipe to do that. But there are, for example, also projects or programs to help you do that. Does anybody know Google Summer of Code? Okay, not that many. So Google basically realized that they're using a lot of open source and it helps them a lot. And I think it's a bit of a PR thing from Google, but it's also to help open source that they pay university students for summer to work on an open source project. And how it basically works is an open source project can apply to Google. Then they accept a couple of projects, you get slots, and then the open source project basically says, like, these are projects we want to do, and then students can apply and say, I want to do this. And basically then you work for 3 months on the open source project, and Google will pay you for the summer. It used to be, I think you got $5,000, but now it's kind of regionalized, so depending on where you're based, you might get a different amount. That's the new system. And that's, for example, how I got started in open source. So more than 10 years ago, I worked for, well, it was a PHP CMS, don't judge me. It was a long time ago. But I worked for 1 summer on the PHP CMS, and that's how I kind of got into open source, contributing to that. And then 3 years later, I was a mentor for the project. And for example, last year, Elastic was also an organization running that, and I was the organization admin basically running that for Elastic. And we had 2 students work for us and do stuff. So if you're a student and you want to kind of prep up your resume and want to make some money, and is maybe a better way to spend your summer than selling drinks or coffee or whatever, then you could do that. And Google Summer of Code is a great way to do that. If you're older, it's probably easier to do that on company time, that if your company has some need and like you need a fix for an open source project, that you do that on company time. I think that's the easier approach. How are we doing time-wise? I think we still have 3 minutes left if there are more questions. Yeah. Wait, we even have a microphone now.
License-related question. Who is monitoring license violation, actually, and what's the responsibility for it?
You mean if somebody uses so somebody takes some GPL code, yes, makes some changes and doesn't open source them? Yeah. Or if I take it in my project. So that is complicated. So basically what you need to do is the company owning the code can take the other company to court. So for example, in the US, there is, I think, the Free Software Foundation, FSF, and they have taken companies to court, like normally very big companies, if it was very obvious. Like they would take some GPL license code, build it into the project, sell it, but they wouldn't open source that. So companies have been taken to court for that. Or maybe if you take code from somebody else and you put it on GitHub, you might serve a DMCA copyright takedown notice, and then your project might be removed. But that, I think, is normally also bound to actually filing a claim in court. So the problem is there is no easy answer for that. It's normally one company taking another company to court. And you, if you have just a small software project, you probably cannot do that and don't have the power to do that. So then it's, yeah. While in theory you could enforce it, you probably don't want to spend the time and money on trying to go the route. So it's a bad world. That's reality. Final question? Anybody, anything else? No? Okay. Thanks a lot for staying up so late and not falling asleep. Enjoy the rest of your evening.